Okay guys, welcome back to part 2 of our photo composition PowerPoint. Remember that we were going through this and we were looking at different guidelines to keep in mind as we are taking pictures to help increase how pleasing our pictures look to other people, okay? And we went through 3 different guidelines so far. We've gone through simplicity, or knowing your focus, right? And parts of knowing what your focus is you've got to worry about simplicity, making sure it's not super busy, that you're not taking away anything from the subject by having a busy background, making sure your subject actually is the subject and fills up the frame, and then using cropping to highlight whatever it is that you want the subject to be. We talked about the rule of thirds, making sure that if you divide your picture up into thirds, your subject and major lines in the image appear to at either these points or along these lines. Okay, and good example here. And the final thing we talked about was balance, and balance was a pretty difficult to define thing because there's so many things which cause visual weight in an image, and keeping them all balanced can be a little bit tricky and takes a lot of experience to do, right? But things like weight, color, using color to make sure your colors are balanced out, light and dark, and then your light and light. Through that, making sure your movement is balanced, that making sure your eye placement or where the person is looking is balanced out with the picture, right? There's a lot of different things which can impact the balance of an image, but you have to make sure to have the most pleasing image that your image is balanced. We are going to move on to guideline number 4 now, which is the use of lines. Lines are obviously going to be everywhere around us, and we can use lines in a way which highlight our subject or take away from our subject. And obviously, if we want to have a good image, we want to highlight whatever our subject is, right? So in this picture, you've got a lot of different lines coming from these steps, and these lines are all pointing roughly towards the subject, which is this child sitting on the stairs. And that's a very good use of lines because it's drawing your eyes to the subject. And lines are very effective at drawing our eyes through an image, taking us almost on a journey throughout whatever the picture is. Okay, and here's a fairly good example of that. Here is your subject, which is the boat. You'll notice this chain, which provides balance because you've got something up top here and something down here, so it's a more balanced picture. But this chain, our eyes are drawn up along the chain and to your subject. Right? It's not taking away from the subject, it's drawing our eyes to it and keeping balance in the image. So it's hitting a lot of things here to make a pleasing photo. This is an example of a very good, pleasing photo, and I'm willing to bet money that as you look at this picture, your eyes follow the road up and down, because I know mine do every single time I look at this image. Right, where my eyes just kind of go up and down the road, because the road is very pleasing to look at, and it takes you through the entire picture as well. Okay? And there's a lot of S-curves in this picture as well, and the S-curve, much like the rule of thirds is something which we know it exists, but it's hard to define why. The S-curve is another one of those things which is naturally pleasing to look at. There's not really a clear explanation why, other than the fact that it is. It's just nicer to look at an S-curve like this. You'll see this in a lot of landscape design as well, where the landscapers try to have S-curves throughout all of their design, their garden design and stuff like that. I know I personally try to do that with my gardens because the S-curve is naturally pleasing to look at. So if you can highlight S-curves in your image, like here where there's a lot of different S-curves, like this image here where there's an S-curve through your river, that is going to provide a more pleasing image. Okay? And also, this is another example of something which is taking you all the way through the image, because as you're looking at this image, you do follow the creek up and down, right? Taking you through the entire image. Here's another example of a slight S-curve through the picture, as well as something which draws your eyes through the entire picture. And this is a pleasing image, not just because of this line taking you through the image, but there's also a lot of balance with respect to the foliage on either side, the colors on either side, and this image has a lot of depth to it because you've got these sheep in the background, and you know how big sheep usually are, and they're so small in the image. It gives you this idea of the third dimension. Even though we're looking at a two-dimensional image, there's the third dimension introduced by having stuff in the foreground and the background. Now, the idea of depth in an image we will get to in this presentation, okay? But this image here has a lot of it. Now that is using lines. Here's a fifth guideline to keep in mind: framing. The world is full of objects which make really good frames, like trees, arches, holes in rock, or holes in whatever object you can take a picture through, creating a frame around your subject. And it's a way of isolating your subject, highlighting what your subject is, keeping the viewer more focused on what they're supposed to be focused on, which is the subject of your picture. Okay? And if you look here, obviously the subject is going to be here through the frame. If you look through this frame over here, you immediately are drawn to what could be the subject, which is that pillar in the middle of that random window, right? So frames are a very good way of drawing your eye exactly to what the focus is supposed to be. And there's a lot of different ways to create frames. This is a little bit more complex of a way to create a frame. This is a fairly easy way to make a frame. And so is this one, where you're actually creating an entire frame around your object. But if you take a look at the lines, you've got these very clear lines on the bridge pointing towards the girl in the picture. You've got the vertical lines kind of framing it in, all causing your eyes to look directly where the subject of this image is, which is in the center, which is this girl walking, right? All these different lines framing her, making her very clearly the subject. Here's another example using trees and the dark ground. So there's a frame of darkness around whatever the subject is, which in this case is the sailboat. Right? And using these in the foreground to create the frame actually adds a lot of depth to the image as well. Here's an example, and I really like this example with respect to frames because it illustrates the idea of frames fairly well, because the subject is obviously going to be these people, but they're also clearly the subject because you've got the frame is dark, taking all of that stuff completely out of the image, and then the couple here, because there's no real lighting on them, they are really dark in this picture as well, amidst this really light background. So it really highlights the fact that they're the subject because all this light and then them, right? And then the frame as well. But everything's framed and using contrast to really highlight what the subject of the picture is. And here's a final example, or one of the final examples of framing is using an arch. Obviously this is going to be the subject and it's completely surrounded by this frame of rock, okay? So that's using natural objects as frames. You can also frame things by using color and lighting, right? Here, this little girl is highlighted by her iPad that she's looking at because it's creating a little bit of lightness in an otherwise very dark photo. So the frame here is all of the darkness, and then she's just lighter than everything else, which causes her to be the very obvious subject because she's surrounded by all the dark coloring. And here's another good example of that, where using the light on the floor, you are framing this little puppy in the light and everything else being darkness, just highlighting the fact that this dog is here, sleeping, adorable, and the subject. Okay? So that is different ways that you can use framing in your images. Guideline number 6 is going to be perspective. Perspective has a very large impact on how we see images. And it has a big impact because you see the world every day from whatever your height is, from the same angle. Everywhere you go, everything's roughly the same angle. So if you can make a twist on that angle and take a picture from a completely different perspective, you completely change what the image looks like. Obviously, but the impact that that image has as well, right? Simply by changing the angle you look at something, you can change how it looks completely. Here is a good example of that, this idea of perspective. Don't be lazy, because we all can take pictures like this. We just stand and we take a picture of our dog, and yeah, it's a cute dog, right? But this image is a lot better, and it is a lot more pleasing to look at, and it's taken from the dog's perspective as opposed to the human's perspective, which we see all the time, right? But another short dog is going to be seeing this, and it just causes the image to look better, right? And yes, obviously they've done some editing in this picture as well. They've blurred out the background so the dog stands out. So this picture has been edited a lot more than this one, but you can see this any time of the day, right? This is something which is a little bit more unique of a perspective. All you had to do was, rather than stand up and take a picture, lie down on the ground and take a picture. So when I say don't be lazy, I mean just move a little bit more than you would think to and create that different angle, okay? Here's another very cool perspective image. Rather than just taking a picture of the buildings or the top of the buildings, go right down. And obviously to create this image, you need a really wide angle lens to capture both sides of the street like this. But from a different perspective, giving you a completely unique and very pleasing take on living or looking around in a city. Right? Here's another example of perspective. The same thing as the don't be lazy perspective, basically, because usually you're looking down the road from your angle, right? This is lying down on the road, which I don't recommend anyone really does unless you can tell there's no cars coming. But lying down on a road and taking a picture from road level out changes the perspective and makes it a really intriguing image to look at. This is another really cool image. Let me tell you from personal experience, we went to Ireland. It's called the Cliffs of Moher, which are 200 and something meter tall cliffs. This is a terrifying perspective to look down on, and I didn't want to get much closer to the edge than I did. But we actually found a spot because we hopped the fence and we went somewhere where you were allowed to go, but it was considered a place where you shouldn't go for liability reasons, because if someone fell, we wouldn't be able to sue. But we didn't fall. We just sat on the very edge of this cliff, and there's nothing quite as terrifying as sitting out with your legs dangling 200 meters above the ground below you. But we did it, and it was a lot of fun. But this perspective is so cool, because when you're looking down 200 meters at stuff, it just looks completely different. Right? So again, a very cool perspective here. And so when you are taking your images, absolutely take the normal shot, but also see if there's a way that you can get a different perspective on what it is that you're taking a picture of, and see if that highlights the subject a little bit differently and in a little bit more pleasing manner. Okay? Guideline number 7 is depth. When you are taking photos of things, you're using a two-dimensional medium, right? Because you've just got your piece of paper that you're printing your picture on, to try to represent the 3 dimensions that we live in. And that is very underwhelming a lot of the time, because you're so used to seeing things in 3 dimensions, and suddenly it's just squished on a piece of paper. It's very hard to convey depth effectively without planning it. Okay? So this is just going to give you different ways to look at what depth is and how to apply it into your images, because composing your photo in a way which implies the depth that is actually in reality will make your photo look so much better, right? Now, this image is very nice to look at because it's very obvious how far away these mountains are from these sheep, right? And just knowing that that depth is there and being able to see it in the image is something which is naturally very pleasing. Make sure when you are taking your picture that you have objects in the foreground and the middle ground and in the background, so that you can understand the depth that walks through your image. And it's helpful to have repeating objects like this, because you know that this is going to be the same size as that, which is going to be the same size as that and that, right? These bales are going to all be the same size. By showing them all at their different sizes, you're conveying how far apart they are. Right? And that's adding that 3rd dimension. Or this one, the repeating light pole getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and closer together, is showing you the depth that is here in this image. And also having the car tire over here, right? You know how big this car is going to be on this image, and looking how small these cars are here and here, you can tell the massive amount of distance that's between them. And obviously also the foreground here, you've got your road, and way in the distance, you've also got your road really, really small over here with the mountains around it. This image has a lot of depth for a number of different reasons, but those are some of the things which help convey the depth, okay? And along the same sort of thinking as having the same thing repeating over and over again, you've got this fence which starts off really, really big, gets small, and moves around. Just seeing the progression of that fence getting smaller and smaller gives the picture the depth. Okay? If this is a picture of a lighthouse without that fence there, it's still a very nice picture of a lighthouse. That's a little bit bland. Adding the depth is what gives it that really pleasing look. Okay? So through your pictures, make sure you're also trying to add depth to them. The final guideline we're going to talk about is pattern and symmetry. Okay? You would argue that they're kind of 2 different guidelines, but they're also sort of the same, because patterns and symmetry sort of are the same thing. We are surrounded by symmetry and patterns, and we naturally look for patterns and symmetry, and when we find those, it's naturally more pleasing to us. Okay? So quite often, highlighting a pattern and highlighting symmetry is going to lead to a pleasing picture. However, sometimes showing something breaking the pattern of symmetry also leads to a much more pleasing photo. So this is going to require something which needs experimentation. Right? So here's an example here, the very regular pattern of these windows going up and down, and the perspective also leads a very cool image here. But seeing this pattern of regularly repeating windows, it is naturally pleasing. Having that pattern a little bit broken up by the people is also kind of cool to look at. So it's not just the same boring thing over and over and over again, but this pattern here, and showing this pattern from a unique perspective gives a very nice image. Here is one where you've got a very regular pattern of these blue lines on the orbs with the subject having a very clear break to the pattern, which not only highlights the subject effectively, but does create a pleasing image to look at, because this does look really cool. I think if this was a blue line instead of an orange line, it would be somewhat of a boring picture, but that contrast here really, and that contrast being right in the rule of thirds moment, that creates a very nice image to look at. Here's an example of using symmetry about the road. So you've got the road, the lines, and then basically the same thing on either side. So there's the symmetry. You also have asymmetry in this picture because you've got green on the one side and you've got brown on the other, which does look really cool and creates this really neat, very symmetrical, but also very asymmetrical image. Okay. Here's another example of using symmetry very effectively to create a very interesting image. Also, the perspective here is adding a lot because you don't really see bridges from this angle very often, right? But this is a very cool picture to look at because of that symmetry that you see on either side of the center of the picture, the bridge here and the bridge there. And it just looks very pleasing to look at. So that is about it for the composition of photos. Different things to think about as you are taking pictures, different things to consider. As you work through the rest of your project, please have fun with this. Take pictures of a whole bunch of different things. Figure out what works and what doesn't work. If all you have is your phone, again, that is fine. If you have something which can take higher resolution images, that is going to be better because you will produce a better quality image, but you work with what you have, okay? So that's photography. When we're done working on the assignment, which I will give you some more time to finish up, then we will be moving on to photo editing, which is a lot of fun and it's very cool to do and surprisingly easy as well to do the basics. Obviously doing good photo editing takes a lot more practice, but that's kind of where we're working towards now, so we can take pictures now and then we're going to be able to edit them later. Okay, that is all for this presentation. Like, comment, subscribe. Yeah, until I see you guys again, take care of yourselves.